So let's talk through our Intercessors and Infiltrators, Inceptors, Incursors and Eliminators, with an overview of every single Space Marine infantry type and a rough rating of how strong they are in order. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines, and in this video I thought I'd do a rough ranking of every single Space Marine infantry squad in the game, talking through all the options from the core codex, strengths, weaknesses, and why I've ranked them where I have. For this video I thought I'd stick to the core codex, given that there's quite enough infantry units to be going on with just there, a big 25 of them, and for this one we're going to be focusing on infantry units, so not characters, vehicles or bikers, and I'm leaving behind any of the divergent chapter infantry squads, as otherwise the list would be twice as long with units that are only relevant to one specific army. In the video I'll aim to rank each infantry unit in order, though I must admit, even more so than tier lists, this is going to be a slightly arbitrary list. It is pretty much impossible to give accurate individual placings for things when you're comparing, say, mainline damage dealers to utility units, and some units that might be radically better or worse given a certain detachment. And I feel like units in 10th edition are kind of interesting just in their own right due to interesting unit special rules, which again can be massively useful for some armies, or maybe a little bit less so for others. I'd probably not treat this too seriously, more for entertainment purposes. I could have been kind of happy with the list even if it had looked significantly different for this. It depends what you're trying to value and talk up a bit. Still though, I've tried to establish a rough sort of order of power level, and we'll go through each unit in turn, talk about a few of the strengths and weaknesses in my opinion, some detachment or chapter synergies if they're particularly stand out for them, and roughly why I've ranked them where I have. Jumping straight into it, and we have the Tactical Marines. I have chosen to rank the Poor Firstborn Troop Squad in 25th place here. 160 points for 10 Space Marines with a heavy weapon, a special weapon and a sergeant. And overall I feel like they're one of the units that's least likely to get used in competitive lists, even though realistically I don't think they're all that far behind. You certainly could get away with a unit within an otherwise honed list. Cheap troops with a heavy weapon to sit on a backfield objective, and then maybe one with a special weapon and the sergeant to push up into the midfield. You are at least getting cheap bodies with marine profiles at 16 points per guy, and they're all objective control too that helps with points. For heavy weapons I'd perhaps be most tempted by a las cannon, for the specials maybe a melter or plasma, and they do have the advantage that their combat squad special rule means that you can split them up into 2 5-man units rather than having to stay into a 10-man squad, which was a massive weakness when the index first came out in 10th. Still though, for most army lists I feel like Tactical Marines are probably going to get passed over. They've got really quite bad melee for the cost, for some reason still getting less attacks than the Primaris Space Marines. The bolters in the units without the keywords or AP really aren't that exciting. I feel like they're essentially a squad that basically has no real special rule at the moment, as their combat squad special rule is just kind of giving them a rule that the other squads already have, as they can already be taken in 5s. I guess for unit use they might quite like the Ironstorm Spearhead for some single rerolls, maybe on a las cannon and a plasma gun in a second unit. Though in reality, if you want to field tactical squads competitively, you're probably best to do it with Black Templars. They can get essentially the same thing but better, a las cannon and a special weapon in a 5-man Crusader squad for just 65 points, so pretty much flat better than the standard tactical squad in every way there. Also at the lower end of this list I've chosen to rank Reivers as well. I've placed them in 24th as they're just a unit with ongoing issues that they've had basically ever since they came out. There's very few units that have been this consistently poor performers over the editions. They are 85 points, so at least have the advantage of being cheap for the bodies that you get. They get precision attacks, battle shock debuffs if you get close, innate deep strike should you wish it, and perhaps one of their more interesting combos is with the Phobos Lieutenant, being one of the more reliable units to charge out of reserve with that, as they can move in the shooting phase after they've shot and get closer for a nice close charge out of nowhere. Could be kind of interesting in the first company task force as well, as they've got an interesting enhancement that can convert failed battle shock tests into actual slain enemy models, and the Space Wolves do have their own fun unique version in the hands of Morkai, which just have a fair bit more punch with their devastating wounds. However, when they get to combat, most of the time they're just going to be very lackluster. Strength 4 and AP 0 attacks for the most part just aren't going to bother much besides light infantry. They're only objective control 1, and their battle shock debuffs are just really random. They're often still going to do nothing, and even the force test that they trigger in your own turn usually isn't going to actually have any impact on the game. Beyond that, there's just absolutely tons of Space Marine infantry squads that offer more threat or more utility than them, so they're rarely going to get taken competitively. Next, in 23rd place, I've chosen to rank the Vanguard Veterans, 105 points per 5 in the unit. For positives, they're fast with jump packs, they get the built-in deep strike from those as well, and get lethal hits on the charge with a flurry of strength 5 AP1 attacks, so at least can punch up a tiny bit more than they would be able to otherwise. Then they can either choose a bit more durability with storm shields, or fancy pistols for some extra damage dealing. Unfortunately, I just don't think that the numbers really line up for them all that well at the moment. Without anything with particularly standout strength damage or AP, again they're going to be somewhat shoehorned into dealing with medium or lighter infantry. And I feel like since the Assault Intercessors with jump packs at 85 points, you'd really want to take these guys given that they're arguably more threat with their devastating wounds and power fist. For support, I guess the Gladius detachment could help them out a bit with a lance melee stratagem that gives you extra AP in the assault doctrine, also advancing and charging. And Blood Angels could be a bit more interesting with them, given that they've got some character choices as soon as they update the character attachment rules anyway. Even here they are going to be competing against things like Death Company, which do hit a lot harder. Next up, and in 22nd place, I've ranked the Desolation Squad, 200 points per 5 of them. Kind of ludicrous that they started out the game at 125 points, so you would have had 10 of them for 250 before, but I feel like Games Workshop has now probably cranked up the points cost to where they're just not all that efficient, and limiting the units to 5 model squads just really limits the scope of any buffs that you can put on them, either stratagems or attached characters. For positives, I still don't think that their ranged damage is absolutely awful. They do get some useful barrage fire, and then can step up when it's safe to do so to fire off a volley of super crack rockets. Between those two, that's still a good amount of heavy hitting. Gladius could give them extra AP from Storm of Fire, the Anvil Siege Force could get them a +1 to hit, and Deathwatch could help them out with things like sustained or lethal hits for a couple of turns as well. In general though, I think if you want Ignore's line of sight firepower, you're almost certainly going to be better off with a Whirlwind at 145 points and a bunch of Strength 8 and Damage 2 attacks. These guys are also crazy fragile if your opponent does have units that can reach them as well. 40 points for a standard marine body just isn't very good. Next up, and ranked in 21st, we've got the Suppressor Squad, 85 points per 3 of them. I'd say they're a unit that can have some use, but are just maybe not quite as exciting as a lot of the other things out there. I've certainly very rarely ever seen them in competitive lists in 10th. They strike with some generalist strength 8, AP1 and damage 2 shooting output, have built-in deep strike and good movement, so they are likely to be able to get where they want to be. Having deep strike on a fairly cheap unit is nice enough for dropping down and doing secondary objectives. Their suppressing fire type rule also gives you -1 to hit on one nominated unit as well, which is nice. Can be pretty handy if you can land that on one of the scariest enemy units they have. For downsides, again they're really quite fragile. For the 85 points just for 3 Space Marine bodies, they still have the slight awkwardness of having to choose either between using their jump packs or staying still to hit on a reasonable ballistic skill of 3+. They don't have any character attachment options, and are generally quite a small unit that you wouldn't really want to use stratagems on too much. And perhaps more than anything else, they're competing with the Inceptors for jumpy infantry that shoot. With the 3-inch deep strike drop plus good damage output, Inceptors really seem to be next level at the moment, and that's one of the reasons why Suppressors don't get a look in, I think. Next up in 20th, I chose to rank the Company Heroes, 85 points for 4 Primaris Command Squad members, and I find these a kind of weird unit to rank, as in their own right they're really not too bad, really quite tanky for the cost with 4 wounds and a -1 to wound built in. They're at least fairly cheap and have decent enough OC due to the standard, plus a little bit of both range and melee. However, perhaps the problem is that they need to have a character in just to justify their existence in the first place, and then after you add the character, I feel like the squad actually gets to be quite a bad deal, as the vast majority of Space Marine captains and things are going to be wasted on just buffing a squad of 4 guys. They want to be joining your biggest and scariest damage dealers. And also when you've accounted for the extra cost of your captain, the squad actually isn't all that tough per point anymore, as characters are really quite fragile for the cost. The damage output of the overall unit just doesn't wind up to adding up to much for the 160 odd points it's going to cost. So basically the vast majority of characters out there are better somewhere else. Basically any character that doesn't really care too much about joining one unit, but instead has buffs that do other things, will probably be better here. Perhaps one of the best might be Vulcan Hestan to direct his fire buff somewhere else on the board. I think he's perhaps the one character that makes the unit really quite strong. Or maybe they could run with Yuri or Ventress if he's mainly being brought in to deep strike a different unit. In general though, outside of a few very niche cases, I just feel like they don't add up to much and aren't really going to see much play for say standard captains. Next up, and getting a bit more interesting in my opinion, we have the Heavy Intercessors. They're 105 points per 5 big chunky Gravis boys, and the main attraction to taking them is their massive durability for the cost. They do bring 15 toughness 6 wounds to the table, which I think is fairly standout for the cost, plus are extra durable against small arms. They're OC2, so should look up points a bit better than most things, and they've got long range bolters with strength 5 and the heavy and assault keywords, which can be quite nice with certain things like the Anvil Siege Force, and their tankiness can be quite nice with some units like Ironfather Fyros, who might be sitting around buffing a vehicle while also making the squad even tougher. I feel like the problem with heavy intercessors though is that they're just a unit that's aggressively kind of fine. They don't really have very much damage output for the points cost that you invest in them at 100 plus points. They don't really want to push up into the midfield all that much, given that they're not really very good in melee and that's going to ruin their shooting, but they sort of feel like an overcommitment to a home field objective at the same time, as you could either hold the point with less investment and something cheaper like a standard intercessor squad, who also bring these sticky objectives, or spend the same sort of points on some fairly awesome deep strike denial for infiltrators, both of which might really add up to be the better option and cost less in both cases. Definitely not unusable, and putting that many gravis wounds on the board could certainly put your opponent under a bit more pressure to remove them, but I can see why they're not taken as often in more competitive lists. Next up, in 18th, I've chosen to rank the Centurion Devastator Squad, 175 points for 3 of these chunky little exosuits. Again, they are perhaps kind of rarely taken, though their actual anti-tank damage really isn't too bad when accounting for their re-rolls, and particularly if they can target something on an objective, and they're a bit more general purpose than some anti-tank platforms out there. Their blast missiles mean that they're a bit more effective against squads, and particularly things like Terminator equivalents. They do have the quite major disadvantage of not having any characters that can join them, but other than that, they're quite a good unit for anything that can use focal stratagems on things, particularly things that are locked to infantry, and they're one of the most powerful shooting infantry units that you can get. However, they definitely come with their disadvantages. They're very slow with just a 4-inch movement, and that means they're almost like static firepower in your own drop zone, and they're not really all that durable per point either. Anything with high strength, AP, and multi-damage will really make a mess of them, and perhaps even more so than some other vehicles out there, as things like Plasma and Melter are a lot more effective against them than vehicles due to their toughness value. With Space Marine big tanks with heavy guns generally being in quite a good spot right now, that's perhaps the biggest reason that I'd say they get outcompeted by those, but I wouldn't say they're unusable. They're kind of interesting, maybe in the Vanguard attachment for the +1 to hit and extra AP. That's very nice with their grav cannon option, should they take that. They could make use of reserves or things that could deep strike them like Uriel Ventress, and the detachments that allow you to advance and shoot in some form like Gladius or the Firestorm could be interesting to at least give them a little bit more mobility. Next up, I've chosen to rank the Sternguard Veterans in 17th place, 100 points for 5 of them or 200 for 10. A unit that I think is still somewhat interesting, but has definitely dropped a massive amount compared with where it was at the start of the edition, losing things like Oath of Moment for reroll wounds, which was excellent with their devastating wound weapons and also their big shoot twice rule, instead just traded out for a slightly buffed wound roll against Oath of Moment targets. Still though, for 20 points per model, I don't think their damage output is really that bad. 3 shots at 12 inches with some AP and devastating wounds means they're a lot more threat than say standard intercessors. They get a devastating wounds heavy bolter, and now the sergeant gets a power fist included, making them at least somewhat capable in melee. I think they're kind of interesting for character attachment options as well. Some characters don't get the option to attach to units like Hellblasters, like say Chief Librarian Tigerius, and he could be an interesting choice to lead them, giving them things like free overwatch and a -1 to hit, as well as extra damage. They're kind of interesting in the first company task force as well, should you choose to run that, as they work quite well with the big reroll wounds on Oath of Moment, getting more devastating wounds. At the moment though, I still feel like their damage output and defense just maybe isn't quite exciting enough to break through for the points cost. I don't think they'd have to drop down very far to get them a lot more plays, but they perhaps feel like they're in a similar sort of place to the Intercessors, damage output that's maybe a bit better than a lot of the other Space Marine squads with interesting supporting rules, but maybe not quite sufficiently good enough to compete against units that do big damage to tanks and vehicles. Next up, in 16th place, I've chosen to rank the Devastator Squad, 120 points for 5 of them, or 200 points for 10. They can provide some dedicated anti-tank firepower of one sort or another, either a bunch of las cannons, or maybe some grav cannons, multi-melters, or even plasma cannons if you'd like. They ignore cover when they're stationary, and can flip a hit to a 6 with the Armorium Cherub once per game, which can be kind of big on a single las cannon shot or something. The multi-melter loadout feels quite nice with the Razorback as well, which allows you to both get them into range and also allows you for wound rerolls against the same target once they get out and start blasting. They do have a fair few downsides though. They are pricey for their defensive profile, so not very durable per cost. If they want to hit on a 3+, they need to be static, and they lose the ignore cover if they're not, meaning they often want to be standing and shooting. And again, like the Centurion Devastators, I feel like their damage output might be compared against other units, particularly the Space Marine tanks if you're just thinking about sitting and shooting in your own deployment zone. And out of the Infantry squads, Eradicators and Hellblasters seem to be more likely to get the nod these days. Still though, some detachments could have some good use for them. The Anvil Siege Force could have you some +1 to wound las cannon sat in your deployment zone, which is scary. And the Firestorm helps them out with assault keywords and gives you lots of boosts that could be very relevant on a Razorback squad disembarking. Strength 10 multi-melters at close range does seem rather nice. Next up, in 15th place, I've chosen to rank the Centurion Assault Squad. More big chunky armoured exosuits, this flavour with siege drills and hurricane bolters on the chest. They do have genuinely good damage close range, kind of similar to Aggressors in a way. Solid damage that can sweep light infantry away, and then followed up by 3 very punchy hits with those siege drills each. Strength 10, damage 3 and AP 2 is excellent for killing Terminators. Twin linked means that it wounds vehicles really well, and it gets a big sustained hits against vehicles and monsters too. They could perhaps use a Land Raider to get close. Firestorm might be quite nice with that for some strength 5 shooting in close. They make good use of Armour of Contempt, and options that could deep strike them. It could allow them some interesting tricks with rapid ingress, say Yuri or Ventress. For downsides, again, moving only 4 inches definitely has some big negatives. It means that the enemy could potentially just run away from them if they're just moving up the board and they need a way to be delivered into combat. And again, like the Devastator Centurions, their durability just isn't really all that great if they're hit with anything with good strength, damage and AP. Unlike Aggressors as well, which feel like they could be in a fairly similar place, they don't have any option for character buffs, which is a bit annoying as they can't be relevant for things like enhancements in your army, which is often something that you might want to put in, say, something like a Land Raider. Still though, they're definitely scary threats if you can get them in close. Next up, in 14th place, I've chosen to rank the Assault Intercessors, 80 points for 5 of them or 160 for 10. At just 16 points per model, they're joint cheapest infantry in the Codex along with the Tactical Marines, at least for power armoured models anyway. They're objective control too, and they deal some fairly solid damage in combat, mainly against lighter infantry, but they do get a good volume of chainsword attacks and full wound rerolls on objectives, meaning that they can punch up a little bit better than some units out there. The Sergeant gets the option of a Power Fist, and I've got quite good attachment choice for characters, though I feel like a lot of characters would generally want to lead other things like Bladeguard Veterans out of choice. Just in general, usually if you've got a melee character wanting to boost a unit, then boosting things with a bunch of high AP and damage 2 attacks is usually going to be the better move. I feel like they're kind of okay in smaller numbers, just for expendable units to take objectives, and probably going to be traded out with the enemy counter-attacking them, and they can certainly bully light infantry really quite well indeed. For formations, Gladius is interesting for advance and charge, and also that Lance Stratagem for +1 to wound and extra AP, that could turn them into a real killing machine unit for a turn. The Blood Angels detachment could be nice as well, strength 5 melee with more attacks improves them a bit, and again they could use Red Rampage. Next, I've ranked the Infernus Squad in 13th place, at 85 points per 5 or 170 per 10. The Flamer Marines do pretty excellent damage against lighter infantry, though are going to struggle against anything that's toughness 5 or over or has high saves. At 85 points, they're at least fairly cheap and expendable for objective scorers though. Perhaps the biggest draw to them in most detachments besides Firestorm is their Overwatch threat, where if they park themselves next to an objective, the opponent basically isn't going to be able to just move some light infantry on it to claim it without them getting barbecued. They really do shine in that Firestorm assault force though. Strength 6 flamers with assault is already helping their issues out quite a lot. Then they've got the option of Torrent with devastating wounds for 2 CP, maybe backed up by Vulcan Hestan to give them full wound rerolls, potentially averaging something like 10 plus devastating wounds out of just 1 unit. Outside of big wombo combos like that though, they do have their downsides. They don't really do much to anything with high toughness or high saves. They are short ranged and nothing special in melee, and only objective control 1 versus Intercessors and Assault Intercessors that you might use for a similar role. Their Battle Shock test rule in your own turn is a bit of a weak one as well, I think. Overall, I'd rate them as a unit that's really quite strong in Firestorm, but kind of lackluster elsewhere. Next up, in 12th spot, I've ranked the standard Intercessors, 85 points for 5 of them, or 170 for 10. In general, I'd be tempted to take a squad of 5 of them, and mainly to use their sticky objectives rule, which is quite helpful. Ideally, if you can start them on a home field objective, have that become yours until your opponent can take it, and then maybe start them moving towards a midfield one to try and do the same there. Otherwise, they're 85 point bodies with some better damage output than some of the other things for the same sort of role. A bit of AP on their bolters, plus helpful keywords to advance and shoot, and they can punch up a bit better than some of the others, getting a grenade launcher with strength 9 and a power fist. Overall though, they're still not really competing for damage compared with actual damage dealers, and they are maybe seen as a bit of a luxury to get that sticky objective rule on the go. Occasionally it can be really quite big. In some games it might do absolutely nothing. I feel like taking a single unit for that objective type role is okay. I probably wouldn't really go much heavier than that though in most armies. Next up, in 11th place, I've chosen to rank the Terminators and the Terminator Assault Squad. The standard variant 185 points for 5 of them, the Assault variant 195. I think at those price tags they are fairly well balanced at the moment, both pretty usable. For their biggest drawing points, I feel like the Terminators are a particularly nice unit for focal synergies like character buffs and stratagems. You can get potentially very big units on them to get good efficiency out of those, maybe the Terminator Captain and Chaplain being some of the more interesting ones. They get inbuilt deep strike, and I think that they're one of the better units for rapid ingress if you want to use that. A Space Marine unit that can do that innately and also hits quite hard. And they are pretty tanky between toughness 5, 3 wounds, and their 2+ save with a 4+ invulnerable, and they'll like armor of contempt. For specific detachment and chapter stuff, the Black Templars get on very well with the Thunderhammer Assault Terminators. If they manage to get their hammers on any psychers, then they can flex into anti-psyker rules for 1 CP, which is nice. The First Company Task Force can allow them to teleport Orin off the board. Dark Angels have their own unique variants and extra support for them. And the Vanguard detachment could be fun to infiltrate an enormous unit of them and potentially have the opponent fighting Terminators in their own deployment zone right from turn 1. For downsides, I feel like for the cost their damage output just isn't really all that strong. They perhaps are in the position where a standard squad of them will be able to at least guarantee some damage on just about anything in the game, and should hopefully be able to wipe out most medium infantry units quite comfortably. They are quite a big investment, and some damage profiles still do kill them perhaps depressingly easily, and they did get toned down a little bit, at least for the core version, with their ignores modifiers rules that they had in the past. It's kind of a shame that that went away. Overall, I rate them a solidly usable unit that some armies do choose to build around, but maybe not quite as common as other things. In 10th place, I've chosen to rank the Incursors, 85 points for a squad of 5 of them, and I would field them in 5s due to their special rule. They can each mark 1 unit that they've shot, and then that can allow your other units to get a +1 to hit against that same unit, potentially giving you really quite a lot of firepower boosts if you line that up on a unit where multiple other units in your army were just about to shoot. It might have slightly diminishing returns as it doesn't stack amazingly well with Oath and Moment, but I guess it means that you can use this on one unit and Oath on a different one, so potentially have different effects going around the board. Besides that, they're fairly cheap scouting bodies, with both their guns and their paired combat blades having just a little bit of extra things going for them besides just the strength 4 AP 0 on their base profile. And the Haywire Mine is actually a fairly big threat to enemies that try and charge them. You might at least get a few mortal wounds out of that. Otherwise though, besides their special rule, I feel like they're not really that exciting. Only OC1, don't really threaten anything besides light infantry, besides a few mortal wounds, and Scout perhaps isn't quite as powerful as Infiltrate maybe. Again, maybe a unit that might be tempting to take one of in an otherwise gunline army that can really use the +1 to hit, but probably not to go too heavy on. In 9th place, I've chosen to rank the Hellblasters, 125 points per 5 of these, and their plasma incinerators are generally fairly fearsome and general purpose, good AP, strength and multi-damage, though they still will be wounding vehicles on a 5+. The fact they do potentially blow themselves up with overheated plasma is definitely a downside, but at least they can turn their casualties into more shooting damage with fires on death on a 3+, and that can be quite disruptive in the enemy turn as well, potentially netting you a last volley of plasma fire as the enemy guns them away. A good sized unit of them can be interesting for character supporting buffs. I feel like a Primaris Lieutenant is perhaps particularly nice with them, with lethal hits to help them threaten tough stuff, and they can also make really quite good use of transports as well, maybe an Impulsor or a Repulsor being some of the more interesting. For detachment and chapters, I think they've got lots of interesting options. The Gladius could have them using the Fire Discipline combo with a Lieutenant with that, Aggressors might be a little bit more common for using that, though Hellblasters are also nice. They definitely feel like an interesting unit to have jumping out of transport in the Firestorm detachment. Anvil could potentially have them at a +1 to wound if they can remain stationary and not just shot dead. And out of the Dark Angels, Azrael seems like quite a nice character to lead them, boosting their shooting and making them harder to kill, while also rustling up command points. I think they definitely have a lot of nice things going for them, though they still have their downsides. They are quite fragile for the points cost and will be high priority targets to take out. And without extra buff lethal hits going for them, they will still struggle to really be that much of a threat to tough things that they wound on a 5+, which maybe isn't super amazing for a unit that you're spending quite a lot of points on already. Definitely an interesting unit though, and quite an easy one to use. Next up, in 8th place, I've chosen to rank the Bladeguard Veterans, 90 points for 3 of these Sword and Board Primaris, or 180 points for 6. They fight in combat with Mass Strength 5, AP 2 and Damage 2 attacks, fairly threatening to enemy Space Marines and anything lighter. And as a Tacticus armor that's pretty capable in combat, they're one of the most interesting choices for the vast majority of melee characters out there. Things like Chaplains, Judiciars, Space Marine Captains, and unique ones. The Primaris Lieutenants with a lethal hit remain a very popular choice and help them punch up against tougher units. They are at least fairly tanky, given 3 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable save, and maybe aren't the worst units to deliver into combat, as they're at least a little bit durable. They could foot slog up. They'd get on quite well with either the Gladius or the Stormlance to allow them to advance and charge, or could be a particularly nice unit to have jumping out of a Land Raider to deliver them into combat in style. Otherwise, they do have quite a lot of good support from certain special characters. Adrax Agatone seems like a particularly nice fit for them, as he both has massive melee at strength 10 and damage 3 to help with heavy hitters, and he allows them to reroll wound rolls. Marnius Calgar could be a good choice as well. Again, he massively helps against tough stuff, but also comes with 2 essentially Blade Guard that hit on 2+ of his own, giving you a really quite big and threatening Space Marine foot melee unit. Both Firestorm and Gladius could be interesting enough to have the access to a +1 to wound melee stratagem as well. Otherwise, for weaknesses, I would say that if they're not really supported by other good buffing options, they're perhaps just a bit so-so. They do kind of need the support to help them actually deal with tougher targets, and their squad size is a little bit annoying for being transported in an Impulsor, which would otherwise be an interesting choice for them. You can't fit 6 of them and a character in there. In 7th place, I've chosen to rank the Eliminators, 75 points for 3 of these Sneaky Phobos Primaris with big sniper rifles. Eliminators do have a lot going for them, though perhaps do face some stiff competition with things like Infiltrators and Scouts. These guys do bring some pretty cool and unique stuff to the table though. Their defense maybe isn't great, but at least they have stealth for a -1 to hit against shooting, which helps a little. For an Infiltrator type unit, they've got some okay damage output, either some damage 3 sniper shots or some big las fusel hits with good AP and damage D6. Depending on the game, it might make sense to either use them a bit more expendably as screens or forward deploy type units, or potentially just sit them back and embrace extra damage output. They can hit on a 2+ and get devastating wounds if they're stationary. Otherwise, if you take the Instigator Bolt Carbine, they can potentially move really quite far in a turn. They get to move, shoot, move, which could be handy for snagging objectives or getting to secondaries, and it can allow them to do some shenanigans, popping it in and out of cover without exposing them to enemy return fire. Things that could allow them to advance and shoot could get them an even faster burst of speed like the Gladius or the Firestorm, and the Anvil Siege Force could get them a +1 to wound when stationary, really quite a scary prospect with both of their weapon loadouts. For downsides, they do have that competition with both Scouts and Infiltrators, which we'll get onto in a second, and both have some very good selling points. Their damage output I think is okay and perhaps surprisingly good for an infiltration type unit, though it's still maybe not stand out for the points, and they are objective control 1 and pretty fragile in melee, just having 25-point marine body profiles. Perhaps not quite as good as some units as scrapping over objectives and skirmishing with enemy forward units. Next up, in 6th place, I've chosen to rank the Assault Intercessors with jump packs, 85 points for 5 of them, and for skirmisher type units to put the smack down on enemy infantry units. I feel like you're probably going to struggle to go too far wrong with a unit or 2 of these. They are perhaps surprisingly cheap for jump infantry with this defensive profile at 17 points, basically the same price as the things that are on foot that move a lot slower, and it's not like they don't have good damage output as well. A power fist on the sergeant, a couple of plasma pistols, and a nice mortal wound impact hit special rule, which helps them out quite a lot against heavy hitters that they'd otherwise really not be able to handle. Inbuilt Deep Strike makes them really quite a nice unit for dropping down to do secondary objectives as well, Quite a nice unit that can just be used as grunts to materialise where they're needed. Perhaps not be quite important enough to draw the majority of the enemy shooting and then make their presence felt quite quickly with fast movement. I'd say perhaps their main weakness is they still are kind of lacking the damage outputs to really be big threats against either massed up enemy heavy hitters or high toughness, high save things like Terminators or tanks and vehicles, though with the mortal wound impacts they could still potentially bully a depleted unit or something that was already highly damaged. When they update the character attachment keywords, I think they could be an interesting enough unit to build around as Blood Angels, maybe attaching things like Dante or the Sanguinary Priest with Jump Pack. It can be quite fun with Kavan Striker the Raven Guard as well, giving them lone operative shenanigans. In 5th place, I've chosen to rank the Eradicators, 95 points for 3 of these Big Melter Primaris. Kind of an interesting unit, but one that's not really all that easy to use comparatively to some. But I think they definitely can have a niche in competitive armies, given that they just spit out the best numbers pretty much against tanks and vehicles. They compete very solidly with other Space Marine damage dealers at 18 inches, but if they get within 9 inches, they're pretty much the best, no questions asked. The main reason is their enormous rerolls against tanks and vehicles. Reroll the hit roll, wound roll, and damage roll adds up to some pretty scary melter there. And there are definitely units that if they roll well, they could make back their points cost in a single round of shooting pretty comfortably. Their main weaknesses is that they're kind of short-ranged and need delivery, not enormously tough for the cost against any sort of serious enemy firepower. So basically something's needed to make sure that they can hit the enemy first before they get hit themselves. There are detachments like Gladius and Firestorm that can allow you to advance and shoot though. The repulsor's reasonable enough, or they could just have a single unit come out of strategic reserve. Plenty of options for getting a scary melter death range on enemy vehicles, though if they do find themselves without any of their prime targets, they will be a bit lackluster against enemy infantry, losing their rerolls. Otherwise, the Firestorm detachment just seems to stand out good for them as well. Strength 10 melters when they get within 12-inch range is big. The Gladius could be helpful to allow them to fall back and shoot, and anything that allows them to teleport into battle could be nice too. Say things like Uriel Ventris or a Blood Angels Librarian Dreadnought teleporting them round the board to get the Alpha Strike on the enemy tanks. Next up, in 4th place, I've chosen to rank the Infiltrators, 100 points for 5 of them. Slightly pricey objective denial units, but definitely very helpful to have around. The main reason that you'd want to take them is their big deep strike denial bubble where nothing can drop within 12 inches, even things that will be able to deploy from deep strike unusually, say things like enemy Inceptors or stratagem options from Genestealer Cults or Chaos Demons. It can be absolutely massive for defending a home field objective, as it means that if something drops down normally from deep strike, they just absolutely won't be able to charge these under basically any circumstances. And if you wanted to go absolutely the whole hog in defending objectives, you could even pair them with a Phobos Librarian, which will also stop the enemy from shooting them outside of 12 inches as well, making them near enough untouchable unless the opponent gets something fairly threatening all the way into your backfield. Otherwise, they can forward deploy and get some presence on central objectives early on. If they can guard a slightly far-flung objective, then all well and good. They are 20 points, but are a little bit more durable than standard Space Marines, given that they get a Helix Adept for a 6+ Feel No Pain. That's quite nice against damage too. They have the smoke keyword and the opportunity to farm stratagems used on them, which could be quite nice. And just in general are really quite a competitive unit, pretty handy to have around, though not every single list takes them. Perhaps the biggest turn-off is that they just really don't have much damage output at all, just standard bolt guns with the heavy keyword and a bit of strength 4 AP0 melee. They're not really going to pose a threat to anything besides light infantry, and that is a little bit painful for an 100-point unit. They are only OC1 as well, which means that they can have quite small units of enemy troops just take objectives off them if they can't clear them quick. Overall, definitely a solid unit to have in the army though. It could be interesting in the Vanguard detachment specifically perhaps as well, with options to redeploy Phobos units or have them reactively moved to the enemy, which could make them even more of a nuisance when trying to skirmish with enemy units that want to take their objectives. Next up, and I've chosen to rank the Aggressors in 3rd place, 110 points for 3 of them and 220 points for 6. I feel like they deserve quite a high ranking just as they're one of the most frequently built around infantry damage dealer units, making some of the best use of characters and also quite a few of the combos that you can do with various detachments. Their shooting volume fire is really quite savage, whether they're Bolt Storm or Flamestorm, a lot of twin link shots and often an AP-1. That should mean that they stack at least some damage even on tough things. and then they follow that up with 3 Power Fist attacks in melee each, all hitting on 3s now and twin links. Again, pretty nicely general purpose, very nice against infantry, but twin linked allows them to punch up. Then they've got some really good support character options. The Apothecary Biologist for lethal hits helps them out, and they're quite a nice choice for the Space Marine Captain in Gravis Armor, who provides his own might and also free stratagems which you'd really want to target such a dangerous unit with. Probably the best way to get them into battle under normal circumstances would be a Land Raider. A good movement, then disembark and still be able to shoot and charge, and they are a unit that could be absolutely catastrophic for the enemy army, even if they just get one uninterrupted term of damage dealing in, never mind if they live past that. For detachment combos, the Gladius is excellent with the Fire Discipline combo, and Apothecary Biologist with that for sustained and lethal hits on a 5+ is pretty nasty. In the Firestorm Assault Force, they can advance and shoot with Strength 5 Flamers, which is big, and on a unit of 6 of them, the Devastating Wound Torrent stratagem will usually get you around about 7 devastating wounds, never mind any other damage. In Vanguard, they could be interesting enough for Infiltrate, and could even be kind of savage with the shooting stratagem if they ever wind up shooting outside of 12 inches. And most other specific Gravis captains are pretty nice with them. Marnius Calgar again feels like a very good choice. Allowing them to advance, shoot and charge all the time is pretty massive and scary for them. I'd say perhaps their main weakness is that they're just not really all that tough for the cost. They might have chunky toughness 6 Gravis armor, but that's still not really all that impressive when they cost 110 points for 9 wounds. And the fact that they're slow and somewhat short range for their best damage output usually means that they want delivery, so they might warrant you buying something like a Land Raider or having options to advance and damage. Still though, a very very scary damage dealer unit, and definitely makes their appearance in lots of competitive lists. Next up, and perhaps on the low key, one of the best units in the Codex are the Space Marine Scouts. Hopefully Games Workshop will get round to releasing the snazzy new models of them at some point, but they certainly seem to be making their mark on competitive lists at the moment. At 55 points, they're pretty notable for being one of the most sacrificial units in the Space Marine Codex, and that's pretty great when combined with Infiltrators as well, makes them some of the most perfect units to start on midfield objectives. Maybe try and hide behind terrain so the opponent can't directly shoot them, and if they want to take the objective, they have to step up and try and deal with them, so they're quite a good trading unit in that way. When they're there, they can also be an expendable unit that can go and do any secondaries that crop up in the early game. And while they're skirmishing with the enemy while doing that, they're pretty good for both damage and defense for just 55 points. 10 wounds at toughness 4 is fine for that, even if they do only have a 4+ save, and their damage output will generally be okay against lighter infantry, plus can either have a rocket launcher or a heavy bolter for a little bit more heavy lifting. Again, for the cost between their shooting and melee, I really don't think they're actually too bad. They can scout to reposition and make sure that they do get either the best jump on the opponents or stay as safe as they possibly can, and then they have a rule to return to reserves when they need it, so they can pop up out of strategic reserve, maybe menace the enemy backfield objective, or turn up to do secondary objectives that happen to appear on the flanks. I think while they're 55 points, they'll continue to crop up in quite a lot of competitive lists, and maybe aren't super reliant on detachments to really make them any better. Firestorm's handy for advance and shoot, Ironstorm could be nice enough for rerolls with a missile launcher, and Vanguard gives them some extra toughness at range and also a reactive move stratagem that's boosted, but I'd say that all of those are nice to have extras rather than essential. Perhaps their biggest weakness is they do die easier to small arms fire than just about anything else in the army, which isn't really to say that they aren't still fairly tough for their cost, but it does mean that any anti-light infantry guns will usually be best shot at them rather than things in power armor. And I'd say that you probably don't want to overinvest in them, maybe 1 or 2 units for trading on the midfield objectives or using their reserves rule. Beyond that, you're probably in diminishing returns. Finally, and the single Space Marine infantry units that have chosen to rank highest at the moment are the Inceptors, 100 points per 3 of them, and again mainly for their role in just winning the mission with tactical objectives, as well as actually having some pretty scary heavy firepower if necessary. The reason to take these, I think, is pretty much entirely for that 3-inch deep strike special rule. Just turn up right next to an enemy unit of your choice, no questions asked, and hit them either with twin linked sustained hits assault bolters or twin linked damage 3 overcharged plasma guns. Just being able to put some fairly vicious firepower exactly where you need it on the map and hopefully set up the Inceptors somewhere where they're not going to be too easy to strike back is really nice. And they do pretty much guarantee that you can do certain secondaries like behind enemy lines or deploy teleport homers. or in the right situation might even be able to sneak a primary objective off the opponent, maybe if they happen to be able to land on the edge of an objective due to how the opponent's unit is deployed, and then hopefully use their firepower to mean that they've got more objective control than them. Overall, I think they're pretty much never going to be a bad choice to add 1 or 2 units to a list. You can't really go too far wrong. They may be particularly nice in Firestorm with +1 strength and also the access to the +1 to wound stratagem, which could make their pinpoint damage even nastier. And some detachments can help them out, like the Ironstorm Spearhead, maybe for a good reroll with a plasma hit, which could be quite valuable. Or the Gladius Task Force for giving the option to fall back, shoot and charge with a tactical doctrine. Could mean that your opponent can't just pin them in melee and just take pistol damage. For their biggest downsides, they aren't really the hardest to kill when they're on the board. They're not going to soak up too much firepower if the opponent just turns around and deletes them with heavy guns. And occasionally you might be in some tricky situations where they've got lots of okay options but nothing really too stand out that they can do. Maybe the choice between killing a less important unit or scoring an objective that's not going to score you many points in a bad position. Still though, certainly very strong, appearing in loads of competitive lists right now, and that's why I've put them first on this list. So anyway, that's an awful lot of Space Marine infantry units. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. As I mentioned, I certainly could have been persuaded to really shift around quite a lot of the units on the list. I do think that quite a lot of them are fairly well balanced, and depends on what detachment you're running or your playstyle. Let me know your thoughts if you would have changed anything too radically differently though. I'll be interested to hear your insights down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.